Trees and shrubs also reduce surface water losses by reducing direct evaporation. So evaporation is simply a function of the area that's exposed and the evapotranspiration rate. You can calculate the potential of evapotranspiration using this very simple, straightforward equation. Okay, maybe not so simple. Evapotranspiration, in plain language, water loss is going to increase with warmer air and soil temperatures, lower humidity, and higher wind speeds. And trees and shrubs alter all of these elements to the benefit of water conservation. So they dampen the air and soil temperatures, they increase humidity, and they reduce wind speeds. So, a very common application of shelter belts to reduce water losses from evaporation through reducing wind speeds. What you do is plant rows of trees and shrubs perpendicular to the prevailing wind, so that's at 90 degrees to the prevailing wind, and you create a protection zone of 7 to 20 times the height of the shelter belt. So the protection is relative to the height of the trees and shrubs. So for example, a 15 meter or 50 foot tall row of trees would create a 105 meter or 350 foot elimination zone. So elimination zone is actually where we're seeing less than half of the open field wind velocity, and a calming zone up to 1,000 feet or 300 meters. So the wind is decreased to 70 to 80% of what it would be out in the open. And if you had planted, instead of a 50-foot tall row of trees, you put a 5-foot tall row of shrubs, 1.5 meter tall row of shrubs, you would create a 10.5 meter or 35-foot elimination zone and a 30 meter or 100-foot calming zone. It's very important, though, that shelter belts should be porous, not planted solid. Our goal here is to create about 20 to 40% porosity. And we would measure porosity by looking at the shelter belt from the side at ground level and looking at how much airspace there is relative to what's occupied by stems and leaves and branches. The reason we want porosity is that solid objects create back eddies, which negate the sheltering effect. So you can see in this graph, the solid line represents a solid shelter belt. And immediately adjacent to that shelter belt, you get a very strong reduction in wind velocity. But within about 2 tree heights, you actually get better sheltering effect when you have a bit of porosity. And I'll show the reason for that by going back up to the previous slide. When wind flow encounters a solid object, it actually deflects the wind downward, where again it encounters a solid object in the form of the ground, and then pushes a portion of that airflow upwards, which means that subsequent airflow is lifted up and above your shelter belt. So you do create a very short area of strong calming, but then the wind returns with force, because not only have you not slowed this wind flow down at all, it's avoided your shelter belt by going up and over, it actually gains a little bit of energy because it went higher up into the air. The wind does have some particulates in it. It consists of molecules, and so there's a bit of a gravity assist that comes down, increases in speed and force, and can actually create a little bit of a scouring effect out in the field. So our goal here then is not to completely block the wind, but have a little bit of porosity, and the sweet spot is between about 20 and 40%. Trees and shrubs also reduce evaporation because they depress the temperatures and increase the relative humidity. So this graph is from research that I did at the University of Alberta. in the lower boreal, which is the equivalent of the subboreal spruce system if you're up on your biogeoclimatic zones. And what we have here is it's showing various environmental factors in relation to, under blue, a no canopy, yellow, a partial canopy, or red, a full canopy. So photosynthetically active radiation is the amount of sunlight that actually used by the plants for photosynthesis. That's the light that is actually used for growth. And you can see from no canopy to a full canopy, you get an exponential decline in the amount of light that's reaching the crop surface. But we also see a depression in temperatures and an elevation in relative humidity. So what is occurring here is actually a trade-off in positive effects. So water conservation that's coming from the reduction in temperature and increase in relative humidity, from a negative effect in terms of loss in the photosynthetic capacity. And that trade-off is displayed nicely here in this graph from Bird, published in Agroforestry Systems. So this is pasture production as a percentage of unsheltered paddock or field, and the influence that a 20-meter shelter belt would have on it. So immediately adjacent to that shelter belt, so within the first 5 to 10 meters, you get a very strong negative effect from the trees because they're suppressing more light than and reducing crop production than can be the benefits that are derived from the soil moisture conservation. Beyond that, it's showing that there is a up to 20% gain, declining over length in the amount of production boost, and that's coming principally in the form of soil moisture conservation. And that phenomena expressed as a net between the positive and the negatives is displayed here as the gray line. So the takeaway message here is that really it takes, for a 20-meter tall shelter belt, about 100 meters before it's a net positive, the difference between the light yield depression and the soil moisture production boost. So about 5 tree heights out. So if you went with, again, a 2-meter tall shelter belt of shrubs, it would take about 10 meters before the net effects of that hedgerow were turned into a positive from the soil moisture gains. Of course, with shelter belts, you're placing your trees and shrubs at fixed points on the edge of the field typically. With other agroforestry systems, we can manipulate the spatial arrangements of the trees to allow more light in and sort of counteract that trade-off between light and water savings. So in a silvopasture system, you could plant all of your trees in an evenly spaced grid, and that would evenly displace the conservation benefits and also the light suppression effects. But we could also arrange them into rows or clusters, and this allows, particularly when you orient those with the sun pattern in mind, opportunity for sunlight to enter the system and feed your crop without being impacted as negatively from the trees, while you're still getting a sheltering effect from that tree presence. A couple of other things you also have to take into consideration as in terms of unintended consequences is if you have an area where you have difficulties in drying a crop late summer or fall, be it a grain crop or your final cut of hay, that increased humidity that's created by trees and shrubs might impede that crop drying. The reduction in temperatures can also delay soil warming in the spring. So again, if you've got something time sensitive that has to be planted early, then the trees and shrubs are going to have an effect immediately adjacent to them that's going to slow the soil warming and delay your planting or crop growth at that point. Establishing shelter belts, hedgerows, and the like, you really have two options. They can be either planted, designed and planted, or retained, a natural or semi-natural shelter belt. Example here from horsefly at Big Bear Ranch. When the fields were cleared, they windrowed the woody material, and those windrows resprouted into trees and shrubs. And this created two net benefits to the farm. One was lowered field development costs because they didn't have to completely clear the field, and they had zero cost in establishing their shelter belts. So it doesn't always have to be a cost outlay. It can be a cost saving in terms of creating shelter belts and hedgerows. If you are planting shelter belts though, some key considerations: certainly planting stock selection. Pay close attention to the hardiness zones. There's I think often a desire to bring in imported species, something that's fast growing or maybe suitable for other farm diversification options, but you really have to take care in selecting something that's going to be winter hardy enough to survive. Early growth and survival are key for trees and shrubs. That's when they're most vulnerable, and that means protecting them from damage from rodents, from wild ungulates, and from livestock. So it might mean the need for temporary fencing until the trees get up to a point where they're no longer going to be impacted by those growth and survival factors. And maintenance is going to be an ongoing issue with any shelter belt or hedgerow. You need to keep it at a suitable porosity, and because trees and shrubs are always growing, you're going to have to do some thinning and pruning and occasionally fill planting, because at some point those trees and shrubs are going to die and leave a gap. And also at the planting stage, it's very important to think through potential crop interference, both above and below ground, and make your species selections and crop tree combinations work for you. We want to work towards a net positive by emphasizing the positive aspects and minimizing the negative aspects. Finally, trees and shrubs not only act to trap and hold moisture, they can lower water demand on the farm. So tree canopies in particular are going to shade crops, livestock, and buildings. That lowers heat stress. Lower heat stress directly translates to reduced water demand. It's going to improve your animal welfare and through that production. And even with crops, cool season crops that predominate in our region, they benefit in midsummer during peak heating times from a little bit of shade and reduced temperature. Well, so you might think again that when on a bright, warm, sunny day that your crops are growing fitfully, but oftentimes because they have to open those openings on their leaves to exchange CO2 and oxygen, that becomes a potential loss of water from the plants. So as a moisture conservation strategy, they will close them up. So your plants midday in the summer are often in full sunlight but not growing because they've closed their stomates to conserve water. So a little bit of reduction in temperature and shading can actually benefit crop production as well as animal welfare and animal production. So to conclude, agroforestry has the potential to build the natural capacity of farmland to trap and retain water. Trees and shrubs on farms create many other potential production and conservation co-benefits. But careful planning is really the key here. We're trying to maximize the benefits and avoid unintended consequences from these systems by just throwing species in a blender. You really want to think out and plan ahead of time about the potential interactions, minimize those negative interactions, and emphasize the positive interactions by mixing species. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.